On my birthday, my husband said he had a surprise for me. I never imagined it would shake the very foundation of our relationship. I live in Harborview, a quiet, picturesque coastal town in Washington. Peaceful streets, fresh ocean breeze, and sunsets that feel almost unreal. From the outside, my life looked perfect. Calm, predictable, almost too perfect. My husband Ethan is admired by everyone, charming, successful, and deeply thoughtful. He always knew how to make me feel special. But this time, he took it to another level. On my 34th birthday, I woke up to a soft kiss and a whisper. "Happy birthday, baby," he said with a mysterious smile. That smile meant one thing. He had something up his sleeve. All he told me was, "Dress up tonight, something bold, something that makes you feel confident." I spent the whole day wondering, a romantic dinner, a weekend getaway, a private moment just for us. But what happened that night? I never saw it coming. At around 7 p.m., the doorbell rang. I expected flowers, maybe a cake, but it was Luca, Ethan's best friend. Tall, confident, that unmistakable calm energy. We'd known each other for years, always friendly, always lighthearted. But tonight, there was something different in the air. He stepped inside, gave me a knowing smile, and Ethan welcomed him like this was part of the plan. And it was. We had wine, music, soft candlelight flickering around the room. Ethan took my hand, looked into my eyes, and simply said, "You ready for your gift?" I hesitated, then nodded. What followed wasn't something I expected. It wasn't flashy or loud. It was intense, emotional, personal. That evening, the three of us crossed into a new space of understanding. One that wasn't about rules or definitions, but about trust, connection, energy. They reminded me who I was. Strong, deserving, radiant. It wasn't about chaos or confusion. It was about something deeper, a moment that redefined what intimacy meant in our relationship. And in the morning, nothing felt broken. Only closer, calmer. Ethan handed me coffee with a smile and whispered, "That was only the beginning." And he was right, because what happened that night changed everything. For the next few days, everything felt different. Not in a dramatic way, but like a room filled with sunlight you hadn't noticed before. Ethan and I were closer. Our conversations stretched longer. Our silences felt warmer. He touched me more often, not out of habit, but meaning, as if something deep inside us had shifted. And yet, that night stayed with me. Not as a question, but as a quiet echo. Something we hadn't talked about, but both remembered. I thought of it while doing everyday things. Cooking, folding laundry, brushing my teeth. Luca's laughter, Ethan's warmth. That strange sense of being fully seen and not having to explain myself. It should have felt confusing, but instead, it felt honest, freeing. A week later, we sat on the back porch, the sea humming in the distance. Ethan glanced over at me with a spark in his eye. "You've been quiet," he said casually. I smiled. "Just thinking." He leaned closer. "About your birthday?" I took a sip of wine. "Maybe." He reached for my hand, fingers firm and familiar. "I've been thinking too," he said, "about how right it felt. How alive you looked." His voice didn't shake. He wasn't apologizing. He was inviting me to trust something new. "And Luca?" I asked. Ethan nodded. He hasn't stopped thinking about it either. The moment hung in the air, not as a question of morality, but as a choice. "Would you want to do something like that again?" His voice was gentle, eyes steady. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be sure. Sure of how I felt. And I was. I kissed him softly. "Maybe," I said with a smile. 2 nights later, after dinner, Ethan wrapped his arms around me and whispered, "He's coming over again. No pressure. Just be open." My heart raced, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This time, it wasn't a surprise. It was a decision. Mine. I changed into something I liked, something that made me feel strong. I took my time. And when I walked into the room, they were already there. The lights were dim. The music low. No awkwardness. No need to explain. Only presence. Connection. Ethan reached for me first. Then Luca. And just like before, there was no tension. Only trust. That night wasn't about crossing a line. It was about erasing one we'd drawn too long ago. And afterward, as I rested between them, breath steady and heart full, I knew. This wasn't about risk. It was about us. And it was only the beginning. After that second night, something shifted between the three of us. Not in a bad way. At least, not at first. It felt like we were circling something new, something we couldn't quite define. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was something deeper. Something like belonging. But the closer we got, the more I started noticing things. Subtle things. Like how Luca's hand sometimes lingered a moment too long. Or how Ethan looked at him, not with jealousy, but with something I couldn't name. One night, as I cleaned up in the kitchen, I heard their voices from the living room. Something in their tone made me pause. "I've never seen her this free," Luca said softly. There was a pause. Then Ethan's voice. "I know. It scares me sometimes. How much I love seeing her like that. You think it'll last?" Another pause. "I don't know. Depends how far we're willing to go." The words echoed in my mind. How far we're willing to go. Were they talking about me? About all of us? Or was something else unfolding between them? The next day, I looked at Ethan and asked something I never thought I would. "Was there ever anything between you and Luca? Before me?" He didn't look away. Didn't deny it. "Once," he said. "Before we were serious. Before you." "And now?" I asked. He paused, then said, "I trust him. And I trust you. That's what matters." That night, everything felt charged. Not planned, not rushed, just open. What happened next didn't feel like something happening to me. It felt like something we were creating together. There were no roles, no expectations, only presence, only us. But the next morning, Luca was gone. No note, no message, just silence. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee untouched. Ethan stood behind me. "He'll be back," he said quietly. "He just needed some space." "Are you sure?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I want to be." 3 days passed. No sign of Luca. No calls, no messages. Nothing. The silence was louder than any goodbye. Ethan tried to pretend it was normal, like Luca just needed some space. But I could feel the truth pressing in. People don't just vanish after something that deep, not unless they're breaking apart inside. On the 4th night, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "Ethan, what aren't you telling me?" He looked worn down, like the truth had been sitting on his chest for days. "He didn't leave because of you," he said. "He left because of me." I sat up straighter. "What do you mean?" He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Before you, Luca and I had a moment. Something unplanned. We never really talked about it. But I think that night we shared stirred something in him, something he wasn't ready to face. I tried to process it. So, he might be in love with you? Ethan didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Maybe. Or maybe he's just confused. But I know it shook him. That answer didn't come with jealousy, only honesty. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. There was a thread between them too. One I hadn't noticed before. Later that night, while Ethan was in the shower, I looked through old photos on my phone. Dinners. Laughs. Quiet mornings. And Luca. Always there. Present. Close. Now. Gone. And I missed him more than I wanted to admit. The next morning, a knock broke the silence. Neither of us expected anyone. I opened the door. There he was. Luca. Tired. Quiet. Holding an envelope in his hand. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside. We sat in the same room where everything had shifted. He handed me the letter. "It's for both of you." My fingers trembled as I unfolded the paper and read. I didn't leave because I was afraid of what happened. I left because I was afraid of how deeply I felt it, and how real it was. Being around you both felt too honest. Like if I let myself fall into that feeling, I wouldn't know how to come back. But I don't want to run anymore. If you'll have me, in whatever way this works, I'm here. I looked up. Ethan's hand gently found mine. And in Luca's eyes, I saw it. Not confusion, not regret, but hope. This wasn't about guilt, or roles, or labels. It was about choosing something that made sense only to us. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We didn't say yes right away. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic decisions, just silence, understanding, and 3 people sitting in a living room that suddenly felt a little too small for everything we were feeling. That night, Luca stayed. Not in the guest room, not on the couch. With us. It wasn't wild. It wasn't passionate. It was soft, still, honest. He lay between us, one arm wrapped around my waist, the other resting gently over Ethan's. And when I looked at the man I married, and the man who had unexpectedly stepped into our lives, I didn't feel wrong. I felt whole. The days that followed were a strange kind of beautiful. We learned how to move together, how to make space for each other in the small, unspoken moments. Morning coffee became quieter. But the glances carried more weight, more meaning. We didn't define anything, didn't dare put a name to it. We just existed in this new, delicate balance. But the world outside? It didn't stop, and it didn't care how careful we were. It started with our neighbor, Harriet. Sweet, nosy, relentless Harriet. She'd seen Luca's car parked outside 2 nights in a row. Then 3. Then 5. And one morning, she caught the 3 of us having breakfast on the back patio. She waved, smiled, but her eyes, they lingered. That afternoon, Ethan got a text from a coworker. "Heard you guys are hosting a long-term guest? Everything okay?" Just a question, on the surface. But we both felt the chill behind it. We sat down that night, the 3 of us. Wine open, fireplace flickering. "People are noticing," Ethan said quietly. Luca rubbed the back of his neck. We knew this wouldn't stay hidden forever. I looked between them. "Do we care?" A long silence. Then Ethan answered. "I care about protecting what we have, but I'm done hiding the parts of my life that actually make me feel alive." I took his hand. Luca took mine. And for the first time, we said it out loud. This is real. But real comes with risk, especially when it's something the world doesn't understand. And the world? It was about to knock on our door harder than ever. Because 2 days later, Sophie came home. Our daughter, fresh out of college, wide-eyed, smart, and completely unaware of the shift that had taken place in our home. She hugged me, kissed Ethan, smiled politely at Luca, and then she said, "So, you're all living together now?" Sophie's question hung in the air like a fragile thread. "So, you're all living together now?" Luca tensed beside me. Ethan's hand gently touched mine beneath the table. I smiled, the practiced kind, the one mothers wear when their hearts are racing. "He's just staying for a little while," I said lightly. helping out with some house projects. Sophie narrowed her eyes. For 2 weeks? She was always sharp, too sharp for comfort. She didn't press, though, just nodded slowly and unpacked her bags upstairs like nothing was wrong. But I knew her. I'd raised her. That silence wasn't peace. It was suspicion. Later that evening, the three of us sat on the patio. Low lights, low voices, trying to process what had just walked through the front door. Do we tell her? I asked. Luca looked unsure. Ethan leaned back, staring up at the stars. If we do, we risk losing her, he said. If we don't, we risk lying every day she's here. I sighed, hugging my knees to my chest. I don't want her to think we're broken. Luca shook his head. This doesn't feel broken. Ethan looked at us both. Then maybe it's time we show her what it really is. The next day, things felt tense. Sophie was sweet, helpful, but distracted. I caught her watching the three of us when we weren't looking. During dinner, she brought it up casually. So, Luca, do you have a room here now or something? He nearly dropped his fork. Ethan cleared his throat. I answered carefully. He's close to us, Soph. She put her utensils down. You mean close to both of you? Silence. Heavy. Sharp. Yes, Ethan said finally. We didn't plan it. It just happened. And somehow, it works. Sophie stared at us. At him. At me. You're in a relationship? All three of you? No one moved. No one spoke. Until I nodded. She pushed back from the table, stood, and walked to the window. The silence was louder than any fight. That night, I found her sitting in the guest room, knees to her chest, tears in her eyes. You should have told me, she whispered. I sat beside her. I didn't know how, I said softly. It's not something people talk about. It's not expected. No, she said. It's not. But it's real, I said. And I need you to know that it doesn't take away from anything I've ever felt for you. Or Ethan. Or him. She wiped her eyes. It feels like you're a different person than the mom I knew. That hurt. But I was learning something about truth. Sometimes when it finally breathes, it stings first. Then, it sets you free. I'm still your mom, I whispered. I'm still the woman who tucked you in after nightmares and cried when you got your first acceptance letter. I'm just also a woman who needed to feel alive again. She didn't respond, not right away. But when I left the room, she didn't slam the door. And in our family, that was a start. The next morning, Sophie was already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes like nothing had happened. Her hair was pulled up, earbuds in, humming softly to music I couldn't hear. But her silence said everything. She was thinking, processing, watching. I didn't push. Sometimes silence isn't a wall. It's a bridge being built. Later that afternoon, she came out to the patio with 2 coffees and handed me one. I talked to my therapist this morning, she said calmly. My chest tightened. And? She sipped her coffee. She said people who love differently don't love any less. Just not always by the rules society sets. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. Then she looked me straight in the eyes. I'm not gonna lie. It's weird. Really weird. But I've never seen you this open, this happy. And I want that for you. I smiled through glassy eyes. Thank you for not shutting me out. She leaned her head on my shoulder. Just promise me you won't turn this into a YouTube channel. I laughed, loudly. We were okay. Not perfect, but okay. But not everyone was so graceful. It started with a phone call that evening. Ethan stepped outside to take it. When he came back in, his face was pale. That was my board chair, he said quietly. Apparently, Harriet's been talking. Harriet, again. What did she say? Luca asked. Ethan sat down slowly. She told them there's a non-traditional domestic arrangement happening in our house. Said it might reflect poorly on the clinic. I felt my stomach drop. The whispers, the glances. They were becoming something bigger, something dangerous. Are they asking you to leave? I asked, afraid of the answer. He shook his head. Not yet, but I can feel it coming. The questions, the judgment. Luca crossed his arms. They can't fire you for what you do in your own house. They don't have to call it that, Ethan replied. They'll find another reason. Too many sick days, budget issues, politics. This was the cost. The quiet tax of being different. And we were just starting to pay it. That night, we sat around the fire pit. No words left between us. Just the sound of logs cracking and the ocean in the distance. If it came to it, I whispered, would we leave? Ethan didn't answer right away. Neither did Luca. But eventually, Ethan said, I'd rather live honestly somewhere new than lie in a place that used to feel like home. Luca nodded. Whatever we are, it's real. And that's worth protecting. I looked at both of them. At the man I built a life with, and the one who helped me rediscover what it means to feel alive. And I knew, whatever happened next, we wouldn't run. Not yet. We'd hold the line. Together. But something told me. The real storm hadn't even started. The storm didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly. A subtle shift in the way people looked at us. In how long they held their stares. In who suddenly stopped waving when they walked past the house. It started with Harriet's whispers. But it didn't end there. Ethan's clinic cut his hours for budget reasons. Luca's clients at the gym started canceling sessions. I noticed Sophie getting strange looks at the coffee shop she'd been working at since high school. People weren't just talking. They were deciding who we were, without asking. One afternoon, I walked into town to clear my head. I passed the Dockside Cafe, where I used to meet friends for brunch. Inside, I saw 3 of them sitting at our usual table. Karen, Linda, Nicole. I paused at the door, took a breath, then walked in. They all looked up. Smiles dropped. Voices lowered. Elaine, Karen said, with that tight smile people use when they're pretending not to be judging. How are things at home? I sat down. Beautiful, messy, human. They exchanged glances. We heard some things, Linda said softly. Is it true you're involved with both of them? I smiled calmly. I'm in love with 2 men who love me back. And we all respect each other enough not to lie about it. Nicole's voice was quieter. Aren't you worried what people will think? Not anymore, I said. I'd rather be whispered about for living honestly than praised for faking a perfect life. And then I stood up and walked out, head high, heart steady. But not everything was steady at home. That night, something cracked. It started small, over dishes of all things. Luca forgot to run the dishwasher. Ethan mentioned it. Luca snapped, I'm not your assistant. Ethan narrowed his eyes. I didn't say you were, but we live together. Responsibilities matter. I tried to diffuse it. Guys, come on, it's just... No, Elaine, Luca interrupted, his voice sharp. It's not just about dishes. It's about the fact that I feel like a third wheel some days. Ethan stepped back. That's not fair. Isn't it? Luca said. You 2 have years of history, a child, a house. I'm the add-on, the extra. Silence. I stepped between them. You're not extra. You're part of this. Luca's eyes softened, but the hurt was still there. Then why do I feel like I'm always one bad moment away from being shut out? That stung, because I didn't have an answer. Because a small part of me was wondering the same thing. Later, after he went for a walk, I sat with Ethan in bed. He's right, isn't he? I whispered. Ethan exhaled. We let him in, but we never stopped holding the door. I closed my eyes. Maybe it's time we lock it. Luca didn't come home that night. The first hour was fine. Maybe he needed air. Maybe a gym session. But by midnight, the silence turned into something darker. By morning, I found his phone still on the counter. And his car gone. Not just gone, missing. He never left without telling someone. Especially me. Ethan and I spent the day pretending not to worry. Cleaning things that didn't need cleaning. Folding already folded clothes. But when the sun started setting, worry became something else. Panic. Then it came. A knock at the door. I opened it to find a woman, late 30s, stylish, with sharp eyes and a half-fake smile. Behind her, a car with Washington plates still warm. Elaine, right? I nodded, unsure. Ethan stepped beside me. I'm Savannah, she said smoothly. Luca's sister. The air left my lungs. He never mentioned a sister. She didn't wait to be invited in. Just walked past us like she owned the floor. Where is he? She asked, setting her purse down with a practiced thump. I've been trying to reach him for days. Then I check his tracker app, and it leads me here. Ethan blinked. Tracker? She ignored the question. You two wouldn't know anything about that, would you? We tried to explain. The relationship. The unexpected feelings. The night he left. She listened, jaw tight, eyes unreadable. So let me get this straight, Savannah said, pacing slowly. My brother disappeared for nearly a week, after months of weird texts and vague answers. And it turns out he's in a throuple with a married couple who didn't even know he had a sister. I swallowed. It wasn't planned, but we care about him. Deeply. Clearly, she said coldly. You don't even know where he is. The silence was suffocating. Ethan tried to stay calm. Look, we know how it sounds, but we love him, and we're worried, just like you. She stared at us for a long moment, then sighed. Luca's done this before, she said quietly. He disappears when he's overwhelmed. Usually shows up with new ideas, new lovers, new plans. He gets too deep, then runs. My heart cracked. But he told us he wanted to stay, that he felt safe with us. Savannah looked at me. He probably meant it, but love doesn't always fix the wiring, especially when the past keeps short-circuiting it. That night, we sat on the couch, Ethan and I, replaying every moment with Luca. The mornings, the laughter, the fire, the fights. And then Ethan said something that hit me hard. I think we let him feel love, but we never helped him feel like he belonged. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't, because deep down, he was right. The next morning, a message finally came. From Luca. No words, just a photo. It was a picture of the beach, the same spot the three of us had watched the sunset from after our first night together. Drawn in the sand were 3 letters, E plus L underneath it. I'm not gone. I'm just trying to come back better. I stared at the photo on my phone until the screen dimmed. E plus L, etched in wet sand, already fading with the tide. He was out there. Somewhere. Thinking. Processing. Still connected. But he wasn't ready to come home. Not yet. Savannah stayed the night. Not because she trusted us, she made that clear, but because she didn't. He's my little brother, she said over tea, her voice quieter than before. And I've watched him fall into situations where people loved the version of him they saw, not the one that always shows up later. I wanted to defend him, to say he was stronger now, more grounded. But I paused, because truthfully, I didn't know what Luca looked like when the shine wore off. Not yet. She walked through the house like a detective, eyes scanning every photo frame, every hallway corner, every hint of Luca's presence. When she reached the guest room, his room, she lingered by the bed. "He never unpacked," she murmured. "That's how I know he was scared to stay." Her words sank like stones in my chest. That night, as Ethan and I lay in bed, he asked the question we'd both been avoiding. "Would you go after him?" I stared at the ceiling. If he asked me to, yes. What if he doesn't? That answer was harder, because love, the real kind, doesn't always chase. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it lets go. Sometimes it doesn't know what the hell to do. The next morning, Savannah was gone. Left a note on the kitchen counter. "I believe you care about him, but love without preparation is just passion with better lighting. When he comes back, if he comes back, be ready to carry what he brings with him." There was no phone number, no goodbye, just that warning, that truth. For days, life moved forward, in small, uncomfortable steps. Sophie had gone back to campus. Ethan returned to the clinic. I poured myself into painting, trying to quiet my mind. But nothing filled the Luca-shaped space in the house. And then, he came back. No warning, no dramatic entrance, just a knock at the door. I opened it and nearly forgot how to breathe. There he was, tired, bearded, a little thinner, but still him. "Hey," he said softly. I threw my arms around him before I could speak. Ethan stepped into the doorway behind me. And for the first time in a week, we all stood there, the space between us closed. But what Luca said next caught me off guard. "Before I say anything else, there's something I need to show you." He pulled a folded envelope from his coat pocket. "This is from before I met you. A part of me I thought I buried. But if we're going to move forward, you need to see it." Inside the envelope was a photo. A boy, maybe 7 years old. Messy hair. Luca's eyes. Beside him, a woman. Dark hair. Sad smile. Holding his hand tightly. On the back of the photo were 4 words. I left them behind. We sat at the kitchen table in silence. Luca placed the photo gently between us, like it might break. The boy looked so much like him. The same shape in the eyes. The same quiet ache in the posture. "His name is Noah," Luca said, voice low. "He's my son." The words didn't hit me all at once. They echoed, fell slowly into place like a puzzle with one piece flipped upside down. "Your son?" Ethan asked, blinking hard. Luca nodded. I was 19. It was complicated. His mother and I weren't in love, not really. We were reckless, and when Noah was born, I wasn't ready. I told myself I'd ruin him if I stayed, so I left. He rubbed his palms together, jaw clenched. She moved to British Columbia, cut contact after a while. I never tried hard enough to find them again. I buried it, pushed it down. I told myself it was better that way. He looked up, eyes glossy. Until that night with both of you. And I woke up thinking, what if I'm still running? What if this thing we have, this love, is the first time I've actually stopped long enough to feel everything I've been hiding? My throat burned. Not with anger. With understanding. Because I knew that kind of grief. The one you dress up in logic and call the past, when it's really just a bleeding wound under your ribs. Ethan reached across the table and put a hand over Luca's. You didn't tell us because you were ashamed. That's not the same as lying. But you need to know something else, Luca added. I've been in contact with Noah's mom, just recently. I found her again. She sent me that photo a week ago. She said, he wants to meet me. I blinked. Does he know who you are? Only that I'm the man who disappeared. The room grew heavy with things none of us knew how to say. That night, after Luca fell asleep on the couch, emotionally drained and curled up like he was still carrying his 7-year-old self, I sat on the porch with Ethan. We didn't say much at first, Just watch the tide pull back from the shore, leaving long silver lines across the sand. I didn't expect this, I whispered. Me neither, Ethan said. But maybe this is what love actually looks like. Messy. Unscripted. Real. I nodded slowly. Do you think we're strong enough to hold him through this too? We don't have to hold all of him, Ethan said gently. Just stand close enough so he doesn't fall alone. The next morning, I found Luca outside, barefoot in the grass, holding his phone. He looked over his shoulder at me. I'm thinking about going to see him, he said. Noah, next week. I don't expect you to come, but I'd like you there. I walked to him, wrapped my arms around his back. We're already in this, Luca. All the way. And if he's part of your story, then he's part of ours too. He turned slowly, eyes searching mine. Even the parts I tried to bury? I smiled. Especially those. The drive to British Columbia was quiet, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried weight, not awkwardness. Like all three of us were sharing the same thought, but didn't dare say it out loud. What if he doesn't want to see me? Luca had whispered that the night before we left, and I told him the only truth I had. Then at least you showed up. That's more than most ever do. We crossed the border just after noon, Ethan behind the wheel, me beside him, and Luca in the back seat, staring out the window with a distant look in his eyes. The town was small, quiet. Everything smelled like pine and damp earth. We pulled into a modest neighborhood, little houses tucked behind fences, toys scattered in yards, bikes leaned against porches. And then we saw her, Maya, Noah's mother. She stood outside, leaning on a wooden railing, arms crossed over a simple gray sweater. She was beautiful in that effortless, unbothered way. But her eyes were tired. When we stepped out, Luca froze. Ethan nudged him gently. Go, he said. Luca walked toward her slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. She didn't smile, didn't flinch, just nodded once. He's inside, playing Xbox. He doesn't know who you are yet. Luca's voice cracked. Thank you, for letting me come. Maya sighed. He's old enough now to decide for himself. She glanced at Ethan and me behind him. And they are my family, Luca said simply. She blinked at that. Didn't ask more. Just turned and called toward the screen door. Noah, come meet someone. He stepped out slowly. 11 years old. Tall for his age. Messy curls and that same cautious fire in his eyes Luca had when he felt vulnerable. He looked up at us, blinking. Then back to Maya. Who is he? Maya didn't speak. She just looked at Luca. And then Luca dropped to one knee, swallowed hard. I'm your dad, Noah. I don't expect you to understand that right away, or want to talk to me. I just wanted to see you, to tell you. I've thought about you every day of my life. Noah didn't move, didn't speak. Then, do you like video games? Luca blinked. Yeah, I used to play. Not good, though. Noah shrugged. I suck too. Want to try? And just like that, he turned and walked back into the house. Luca looked at Maya. She gave the smallest nod, and he followed his son inside. Ethan and I sat on the porch with Maya. She didn't ask for explanations. Didn't ask how his family included a married couple. She just stared out at the yard. He talks about his dad sometimes, but never with anger. Mostly just wonder. Like a character in a book who never showed up in the last chapter. I swallowed hard. He's here to finish that chapter. If you let him. Maya looked at me. As long as he does it for Noah, not for guilt, I nodded. That's exactly why we're here. They played for hours. Luca's laugh floated out through the open window. Noah's voice getting louder, more confident with every round. He didn't ask deep questions, didn't break down in tears. He just let him in. Bit by bit, without forcing anything. Before we left, Noah came outside, a root beer in hand. "Will you come back sometime?" he asked Luca. Luca knelt again, eyes shining. "Only if you want me to." Noah nodded once. "You're not that bad at the game, but you suck at racing." Luca laughed, a real laugh this time. "I'll work on it." Noah turned to go back inside, then paused. "Bye, Dad." The words hit Luca like a wave. He didn't cry. Not there. Not until we were back in the car. And then, as we pulled away from that quiet little house, he broke, and we held him. Ethan in the driver's seat, one hand gripping his, me in the back, arms wrapped around his chest. Because love, real love, doesn't just hold you through the highs. It holds you through the reckonings. Sometimes the most important words aren't "I'm sorry" or "I love you." Sometimes they're just, "Wanna play?" Because real love doesn't always need drama. It arrives quietly and stays. And when he said, "Bye, Dad," everything that was once broken suddenly felt possible to rebuild.